We're now going to move into about an hour of what I've called a facilitated panel discussion. I've not done this before, I'm certainly no expert, but what I'm going to try to do is to leverage on the expertise of the four speakers and one other who I'll introduce in a moment, and try to tease out some definitive answers on the subject that we've been wrestling with all day. I'm reminded of a sort of a greased pig. What's evident is that the topics we're talking about here are something that are not easy to get your hands around and to hold still. They're fluid and they move around a little bit. But I'm also heartened by what I think are some threads of continuity from the four speakers today. So just a reminder that the questions that we sort of posed at the start of the seminar this morning were across 4 eras, and you'll have obviously noticed that there was a little bit of overlap between some of those because they're not distinct. What were Australia's interests, real or perceived? What threatened those interests? What strategy did the Australian government adopt to protect its interests? Was the strategy successful? And what lessons can be identified for the future? So the intention here is not to much focus on the historical side, but to learn from history to try and inform our judgment going into the future. And clearly we're in an interesting period of our existence on this planet at the moment, and there's quite a few things that are uncertain and unclear, and I'm hoping that we might be able to tease out some threads that we could use going forward. I'd like to introduce Brendan Sargeant, who's joining the four speakers for the panel session. Brendan is an honorary professor at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, and he has wide experience with the Department of Defence and has held a number of senior appointments, including Head of Strategic Policy Division, Deputy Secretary Strategy and Associate Secretary. So thank you for joining us, Brendan.
Yeah.
And you would have thought perhaps with that range of appointments that he's got all the answers, so I'm looking forward to hearing from him. I guess there's a couple of ways to go about this, and I guess in terms of procedure what I'd like to do is I'll pose some questions. I'll ask the panel members to offer something if they think it can value add. But I'd like to hold off from questions from the audience until we get towards the end, if that's okay. So you're on receive, not transmit, for a little while. But if we do get to a point where I can throw it open to the floor again, then I'll do so. Again, I don't want to be too directive in this process. So, gentlemen, if you find that your line of thought gets to a point where you would like to pose a question to the panel, or perhaps throw it out to the broader consideration, I'm certainly amenable to that as well. Again, I don't claim to be the expert with all the answers here, far from it, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a meaningful discussion over the next 60 or so minutes. I had some prepared questions which some of the speakers clearly answered in part, or at least gave some inclinations towards. But I guess I'm going to sort of freewheel a little bit here and deviate from that in the first instance, because I think I want to go back to Peter Edwards' first slide, which talked about the word interests. And again, you know, it's a word that could mean lots of different things to different people. But I guess the first question I would like to pose to the panel is, are our national interests and national values the same thing? Are they synonymous or are they different? Because listening to some of the lists that Peter Leahy read out, we very quickly move from what are traditional interests into values, which are a little bit more aspirational. So I guess, can we start with a sort of a theoretical, conceptual question about those two words, interests and values? Anybody? Brendan, why don't you start with?
Can I
Peter?
Can I just quote what somebody else has said, because this happened to be in the Strategist this morning.
Oh, okay, great.
The SP blog, an interesting contribution from Alan B. Could you speak up?
Sorry.
Can you speak up, please?
Speak up.
This is a contribution that I read this morning on The Strategist, which is the blog of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. A man called Alan Bean, who's been in this field for quite a long time, and he is discussing the whole question of the national interest, and what does that term actually mean? And he has said the expression the national interest is a term of art that brings together identity and power. We remain uncertain about our identity, about who we are, just as we are uncertain about what we stand for, our values. So that suggests that this whole thing, you're quite right that values and interests are interwoven. That's what I was trying to suggest in my presentation. But we have somebody who's been working closely in this field for a long time saying, we haven't really worked out what our values are, who we are, and therefore putting them together, what is this thing called the national interest? It's a great phrase to sort of pull down and say, well, we stand for the national interest. And in fact, I think the first foreign policy white paper under the Howard government was called, I think, In the National Interest, which is, is terribly worthy because it's a bit like motherhood, who can be against it? But what does it really mean?
Brendan, I'll come to you in a moment, but again, I'll just make the point. We've often talked about national interests, plural, and yet again, sometimes some people use the term national interest as though it was a singular identity. National interest sometimes translates into lists, like Penny Wong's lists, and you get 3 or 4 dot points. And others would advocate that it is a concept that is enduring. Yeah, Brendan.
That's the national interest values questions one I gave to the students at the Command and Staff College last year. I got 200 responses.
All different.
But anyway, look, I had a look at this and I went through the literature, the official literature, and I could never find a definition of national interest. And occasionally you'd see statements of values, and so I thought that was interesting. And then I was at a speech where Prime Minister Turnbull at Shangri-La in 2017, he talked about in a sort of indirect way values and interests, and he gave what I thought was the best definition, and it was a very indirect definition. But he said something like, and he was channeling Leahy, I think, but he said, countries in our region want to have the freedom to be themselves. And so when I talk to my students, I say our national interest is our ability to be ourselves as a country. Now, what that also means is that your national interests are going to change over time. And because countries are never complete, they're entities, living entities that travel through time, your values are going to evolve as well. So to me, what's interesting about the discussion about interests and values is how our sense of what they are, which is usually fairly intuitive, plays out in our response to the world. And I've often seen government decisions which reflect, which fall hard on the national interest side. Many of the decisions around border protection are all about protecting a certain view of our national interests. And the debate in Australia is that, well, we're doing that at the price of our values. And so they're always in tension and they evolve. And what governments would like to do is get the sweet spot between them, but the world is always surprising you. And so in that sense, the most important thing about it is to have them as a continuing conversation, because I don't think we'll ever get to the other side of that conversation. And in some ways, it's perhaps good that we don't.
Peter?
I think you need to have to approach what the values are and have that discussion. And I think it's difficult for Australia. If you look at the constitutions of various countries, Australia's constitution is a bill, it was an act that sort of came our way.
Administrative document.
But if you look at the constitution of, and I'll pick two, Indonesia and India. Now if you read the preamble to those, there's really something quite strong in there saying who they are and who they stand for. Both being countries that threw off the yoke of colonialism. And I think it's important that you look at that sort of stuff. I think we can do better. I think it's important we do that because they do, and I don't think they're the same as the interests. I think it's important that you take the values and translate them into interests, because that statement sends a message both ways. It sends a statement outside, this is who we are and this is what we stand for, and in the extreme this is what we'll fight for. But similarly they send a message inside to the population and say, well, this is who we are and this is what we stand for, and similarly this is what we fight for. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But that message going outside, if you think during, I guess it was the 80s and the 90s, towards the end of the Cold War, and when we saw some of the reflagging of the Kuwaiti oil tankers coming out of the Gulf, the United States had an expression, this is in the vital national interests of the United States. And that was code, we will use nukes. And we all talk about national interests, and I think the politicians hide behind them, and they use as a bit of a code, no, well, you don't know enough about it. I know more than you do. So I think we do need to say that. And there also needs to be this issue of these are the red lines. Don't cross this one. Now, back internally, one of the things I worry about is identity politics. We have too many identities. And as an ex-chief of army, I ask the question, who's going to fight? Multiple passports, multiple nationalities. I think you should have one. It's the country you're going to fight for. So I think we need to be able to articulate to our population who we are, what we stand for. And my wife has a terrific saying at the moment, and it's around that there are so many victims out there at the moment, we're about to run out of offenders. And I think it's the same sort of thing that's going on here. We should be proud of who we are. And the Chief of Army, I think, is expected to ask the question, well, you're going to fight for me, aren't you? So I think we do need to talk about them and be very clear. Kevin Rudd put forward a series at Sydney University in the middle of 2008, and one of them was mateship. Now, I think they've got it, and even though Bloody Joe Key wore the mateship hat in America, they must, who are these blokes? What are they talking about? I think we have to be clear and we have to be proud of them, but it is an ongoing discussion.
I guess that would then open up the question of national identity. And is it strong? Is it well defined? Or is it somehow being diluted through multiculturalism? Is it something that you think a politician needs to try and fix before we can move forward? No one's taking that one.
Well, I think I'll go to hint.
Yeah, I think the answer you suggested is yes. Okay. So, just to summarise then, I guess national interest is perhaps an enduring concept. National interests are something that can be articulated and are an evolving list, and that, to paraphrase you, Peter, I think that from our sense of national identity we can draw down and articulate the values that are important to us as citizens of Australia.
Well, let me give you an example of out of Europe. I mentioned that after the war, America stayed in Europe and wanted a trading partner. And I used to teach at the Commandant General Staff College in the US, and this was during the latter half of the 1980s. And we talk about an American soldier on the inner German border in the Fulda Gap. What was he doing there? He was the tripline for Soviet invasion. It's interesting were they ever intending to invade. But if you follow it all the way back through the lines of supply, through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and the whole missile defence systems and so on, the interests of the United States, values that I think they have the same trouble that we do. And I used to describe them as mom and apple pie. Australia, it's kangaroos, Holden cars, Foster's beer and meat pies. It's the way you want to live. But you follow it, it then goes to a strategy and explains why that guy is standing on the Indo-German border with bullets coming all the way down through the German rail lines, coming through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is a great place for submarines, coming out of the ports through the Caribbean, which is an extra good place for submarines, as we found out in the Second World War, and why America has their forts in a fan that radiate through those highways that Eisenhower built that go to the Texas ports. That's how you structure a country around the fact that we want to be a rich trading company. And it goes all the way back through those strategies. I'm not sure we're doing it that well.
Okay.
I'm just reminded when you're talking about the national interest rather than interests of when we went into the 1991 Gulf War. There's a couple of interesting points about that. There's been much discussion over the last 10 or 15 years about whether we should, when we go to war, that it should be a parliamentary decision or whether it should be made by the government. In 1991, the government made the decision that we would go to war, but Bob Hawke, as the Prime Minister, did get up in Parliament and put the case almost immediately. And he put the case, which he called, it's in Australia's national interest. And then he listed essentially the three reasons that we're going into the Gulf War. The first one was the US alliance. It's in the national interest that we make part of the US alliance. The second one, it's to support the United Nations and drive home that a country such as Iraq cannot invade another country. In other words, we are playing our part in promoting a peaceful world by standing up against that sort of aggression under the United Nations umbrella. And the third one, he said, and let's not beat around the bush, he said, oil comes out of Iraq, or out of the Gulf, and Australia's economy, a strong Australian economy is also in our national interest. That there's a Prime Minister going to war, stating in terms of the national interest and spelling it out. I just reminded him of that is a case where it has been done.
The gentleman, thinking back over the four eras that we've considered today, what national interests do you see as being consistent across that period? Could I suggest maintaining Australia's sovereignty as the first?
I think one is, I think it was Barton who said that we have a nation for a continent and a continent for a nation for the first time in the world's history. And so I think that's one, defending that federation and Australia as a nation and as a continent.
Yep.
So that's an easy one.
To me, that's the foundation one.
Yep.
When I was in policy, we would often come back to the question of sovereignty. To me, if you want the magic key that unlocks defence policy, it's about sovereignty. It's about how do you understand it, how do you exercise it, and how do you support it through the use of defence. It's not the only vehicle. And so to me, and then once you, and sovereignty becomes more and more important the more constrained or the more threatened you are. And as that happens, your defence forces become more and more important in your policy links. And so, and then the question is, well, how do you exercise sovereignty and what does it actually mean? And it can mean different things at different times. But I always thought that at the end of the day, because, life of countries is so long, I used to say this at work, and we don't spend much time on Earth, we don't know what the future will bring, and you can never assume that anything is off the table in terms of potential possibilities. So, we're always taught in terms of, the capacity to exercise decisions that would enable us to operate in the world free of coercion. And that was the beginning. And then you might then pursue that through your relationships, through your engagement, through operations you participate in. But sovereignty for a nation was the foundation interest. And often, when a Prime Minister, and I won't talk about specific instances, but when a Prime Minister would want to make a decision about the deployment of the ADF somewhere, the question we would ask is, how does that support the national interest, and how does it come back to some logic that links back to the sort of survival integrity of the country within the nation-state system, and therefore the ability to exercise sovereignty. So that was some of the ways in which we would think about those.
But I'd add there that, and Peter, you said it, that had our sovereignty been tested, I think you suggested there might have been one chance that there'd be an invasion of some sort. And I think that whether the Japanese intent was strong or not. So to me, sovereignty is someone's attacking us, invading us, is going to
It's a physical
march down
physical
ANZAC
issue.
parade and take the capital and put their flag on top of it, which is terribly European. I don't think it's an issue for us. There are some of the new threats. So that, I don't think that explains our actions in many of these cases. I go back to that Mayor of Villabreton. You came and helped save our democracy. I think that is one of the things that has really driven us in terms of looking over the back fence, values, a fair go. If you look at a lot of what drove Afghanistan, and we did go to Afghanistan. I don't think we thought it was going to be long. It was about vengeance. But then we're a bit slow to adjust. And I can remember talking to the battle group commanders up there and saying, well, in fact, one is now a Major General who was rather quite rude to me. He said that Army 4-letter word gosh to me. He said, you and your mates in Canberra, you know gosh and use to me. Our commanders in the field were making it up. And in large part, they were looking around a country like Afghanistan and saying, how can we help? What can we do? You need a fair go. And to me, it came home most strongly, and it's back to the point we had here before. I went to too many funerals, and the fathers would generally come up to me and say, why did my son die? And I couldn't tell them because of the US alliance. There were other reasons, but I generally said, because he was helping little girls go to school. He was doing something good for people, doing something good for the world. And I think that's why I talked about strategic culture. I think that is our nature as a population and as a people. We want to do something constructive for ourselves, for our region and for the community.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just bring it back to that word sovereignty, and Brendan, perhaps ask you. Do you think the nature of sovereignty is evolving, particularly through globalisation and the fact that our government seems to have less freedom of action to make decisions, given the number of different organisations around the world that are exercising pressure on us?
Can I answer that question in a sort of indirect way?
Sure.
I actually, listening to all the presentations here today, and I agree with everything that everyone said. That's good. So we've always sought security, we've always traded some of our sovereignty for security.
Yep.
In the Empire context, in the US alliance context. And so in return for giving up some discretion in our decision making, some freedom of action, we've said that we get security from that. We've also got a lot of security from the way the world works. So when we talk about the rules-based order, a certain sort of globalisation and a certain set of rules. Now, that's coming to an end. We've got the rise of the authoritarian powers. We have restructuring of the strategic order in the Indo-Pacific. We've got all sorts of transnational problems, which Peter talked about. And so we're going into a world where, we will see a whole range of crises from small to large, from low end to high end. And the ADF is currently trying to reposition itself for that and finding that it probably doesn't have enough resources. But I think the real issue is that we, in a sense, allowed the nature of the global system within which we have lived, the thing we call rules-based order, which the Defence White Paper in 2016 and the Foreign Policy White Paper spent so much time talking about. We allowed that to carry a lot of our security risk for it. So as a result, we underinvested in defence. We do not have the sustainability that we need. We cannot fly our JSFs for very long because of the pilots and so on. And so, but in a sense, we made that trade-off because we thought that the world was stable and only certain sorts of crises would occur, and they were the ones that we managed. And I think that the future, the challenge for the future is that the reality of the world is that we only can ever have partial sovereignty. So how do you manage your defence and security in that context? So what sort of agreements do you have? How should the alliance work? What sort of risk mitigation do you have to build, in relation to things like fuel, sustainability of the force, and so on. So I think that, the challenge, we've always talked about being able to exercise our sovereignty, but in a sense we've been able to exercise it because larger powers have created a world within which we have been able to do that. And that's what's coming to an end. And I think that's a really profound change. And it means a very different type of strategic, political and diplomatic culture for the future. And it goes back to Alan Dean's point. He talks about power, and he says in that article that Australians are not, well, Peter Varghese said this, he was Secretary of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He says Australians are not comfortable with the exercise of power. And I think that that's quite true, but in the future we will need to be much more comfortable and operate in different ways to the past. And I think, to pick up on Peter's point, that will be a real challenge because it means that our strategic identity may need to change. It may be a challenge to our values. We may have to live in the world differently. And in a sense, and we may have to think about what our interests are and how we pursue them differently. And so I think the values conversation is actually a really important one because I think the world is going to say to us, you've lived in a certain way, you may not be able to live that way in the future. So we're not going to change, so how are you going to change? And the issue for us is, well, what are we prepared not to change? What are the red lines? What are the limits, and so on?
So, Marcus, you said we could talk to each other.
Yes.
Brendan, I'm talking to you. Hugh White approached that proposition, how to defend Australia in the future. We're about 2% of GDP, biased bit. Hugh suggested, I think 4%, 3 or 4% is two options. But he also suggested nuclear weapons. How do you approach either of those things?
Well, you'll have to read my review of Hugh's book.
This is an advertisement, we've set it up.
Copies are at the back.
I think the nuclear discussion is a red herring. The real issue is, would we allow the US to base nuclear weapons in Australia? That's a discussion I want to have. But that's the one about Australia getting nuclear capability. I just think that's a red herring. And it's something that sells books. But, it's not a real discussion in that framework. The issue with Hugh's book, which I think talks about the last day, the existential crisis, when the world is ending, what do you do? I think what is neglected is some of the implications in Peter's talk. Humans have agency. We live in the world. The world changes as a result of our interaction with it. So the question is, what are we going to do and how are we going to live in the world to prevent the sort of things that Hugh talks about from actually coming to fruition? And so, and I think Hugh sort of underestimates human agency and the way the world changes as a result. But what that means for us is that we need to invest in diplomacy, need to invest in defence, we need to invest in our regional relationships, and we need to stop thinking of the US alliance as some sort of bank account which we can draw on at some point in the future. Alliances live by what you do to solve problems that exist now. And then the other side of it is that to pick up on the Afghanistan discussion is to be far more careful about what we will do. I often used to say when I was in the department, I was a real critic of the 2016 white paper internally because I didn't think it had any prioritisation framework to actually decide what we should do or what was more important than what was a hierarchy of importance. But I remember writing to the Secretary and I said, the beginning of wisdom in defence is to understand limits. And in a sense, we need to think about, not only about what we will do, but what we won't do. And so, and I think with Hugh, it was one scenario, and my view is we just don't know what the future will bring. And we should not underestimate human agency.
So Peter Leahy made the comment that I think, what was it, that self-reliance is a pipe dream?
Fantasy.
Fantasy, sorry, my apologies. Largely because of resources available and the scale of the physical territory, as well as our interests that might have a less tangible form. But given that, surely that drives you down a line of thinking where something like nuclear weapons is, possibly the only way that you can achieve some sort of, deterrent effect that's going to give you a sufficient assurance.
Yes, but I don't think the government's prepared to approach that. Brendan's given a view on that. Self-reliance, and I think I mentioned the examples, Joint Strike Fighter would be some of the combat systems inside the submarines, and all sorts of things like that, but just simple things like access to intelligence. I recall when we went off to Timor, the Americans said, well, we'll give you some support, but we won't be going on to Timor. Well, they fit because I found some of them there a little bit later. But they said, what do you want? And so I was in Canberra for a weekend off, that year. And so I went back to Sydney to the headquarters, and I wrote a list of things. We wanted intelligence here, and we wanted this, and logistics over the shore, we needed some lighterage and stuff that we just didn't have, because we're going to look after the Missouri south of Catherine. And even though Timor was about as easy as it gets, you couldn't have gone anywhere closer. We needed support. I put the list in, and there's a bloke called Brigadier General Glad Castellor, who was the US Marine Corps liaison on our headquarters, and Glad had approved within a day. So they do help. But if we go for a big war, there will be other priorities. And I think Boeing has just opened up a new Tomahawk missile factory. Well, what are the Americans doing with that? They're not going to keep 10% of them for us. That's for them. I'm just not confident that even access to codes, access to the GPS, one of the first things they're going to do is turn off GPS, and we hope that we might get it. I mentioned the war in space. One of the first things anybody's going to do is shoot down GPS. So I just don't think that we've spent enough money on it, and even Hugh's 3 and 4%. We just don't have the scale, the R&D, the scientific, technological capabilities to be able to keep up with some of these things.
So it's entirely conceivable that having put our faith in the US for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, the Singapore strategy, the same thing could happen, where they'll be distracted in other parts of the world and we end up with not much left.
No, I think it's more subtle than that, and the historians might have a view on this as well. The US, in my view, is going to stay engaged in the Asia Pacific No, they have too many interests, not to economic and historical and so on. But I think that they will exercise more discretion about what crises they get involved in and how they think about it. And it is quite possible, as has happened in the past, where they will have a different view about a regional issue to us. So I think one of the lessons of Timor, which is, I just don't think we've thought enough about it, is that initially we wanted the US to lead in Timor and they said no. And they said no for their own reasons, some good, some bad. So Australia then had to lead the interfet. And that was a big moment for Australia because we hadn't done that for a long time, if ever. And we had to put together a coalition, and we'd never done that before. And we were lucky. And when you ask, say, John Howard, what was the most important sort of defence and foreign policy issue of his prime ministership, he doesn't say 9/11, he talks about Timor. And I asked him why, and he said because it made the world see Australia differently. Now, since then, we've gone back to coalition operations with the major power. And in a sense, I think in the future, we're more likely to have Timor than to have what is currently happening in the Middle East. And the question I ask is, not do we have the full structure or the capability. Australians are very improvisational, I think that people will make do. To me, the question is, are we ready for leadership? And to me, that's a sort of psychic step up, which we actually haven't had to do many times in our history. And so to me, that's the real, at the heart of the challenge going to the future. Yeah, and it draws in all the other discussions, values, interests.
To lead a regional coalition.
Yeah.
And you're quite correct. At the time, the concept of us doing that for interfet was huge. In fact, we hadn't done it. Little confidence that we could do it.
There's a really good book by General Rupert Smith. He's a Brit, of course, with a name like Rupert. But he came out of the experiences in Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on, and the book's called The Utility of Force. And it's a really good question. Another one after the Korean War, Maxwell Taylor, The Uncertain Trumpet. Do we have the right force for the right time? And we don't always have to rely on military force. And I say that because as we were talking there, I remember, I think perhaps the most important application of force in Timor was the US Secretary of State going to Jakarta. I think it was in about May of '99. Holbrook went to Jakarta and absolutely monstered them. It couldn't have been a bigger monstering than you've ever seen. Said, don't fight. If you fight, we'll destroy you. And so that was a better use of force than any other application of force you could get. And that to me is the problem that we're facing. Another Brit, Basil Liddell Hart, said it's not so hard to get a new idea into the military mind, what's hard is to get the old one out. So we have to have the flexibility and adaptability to be able to look for different ways of force rather than sending the gunboats.
I'm drawn to Peter Edwards' observation that we like the status quo, that we're very comfortable with the global system that's here at the moment. We like the rules-based order, we want to hang on to that. We're clearly living in a period of unprecedented change and an accelerating rate of change. Is there a risk perhaps that we are, getting caught or not being reactive or not reacting enough or getting ahead of change, perhaps being proactive enough to stay ahead of those changes? It just strikes me that strategically we're almost adopting a bit of a Maginot Line mentality where we've built up what we've got and we just hope that it does the job, and in the meantime the rest of the world's moving on past us.
Yeah, you're asking me, yes, I think that is true. I think partly what we've seen in recent years is a certain winding down of our capacity at the diplomatic end. We need a, thank you, we need a whole of government response, that great mantra. And what we've seen well, ever since the reorganisation, the Tang report of '74, is that our military have become much better at quasi-diplomatic activities. You've mentioned Peter Cosgrove in Timor and so on, and one might also mention John Sanderson before that in Cambodia. What has run down on the other side is that foreign affairs, since its heyday under Gareth, has been very much run down, and the days when a distinguished career in staying in the department meant something is almost over. It seems, as in the latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs Minister Tommy Tyler has said that we're risking having a department which is involved in managing ministerial visits, consular activities, bailing out drunken Australians overseas, and something else of equally minor, consular and all that sort of stuff. And the best and brightest diplomats in the last 30 years have gone on to be appointed to jobs that really matter, like running defence or ONA or ASIO or ACES, and that seems to be the mark of approval. I think we're suffering from that now. We really need a good foreign policy thinking, based on years of experience, either generally or in specific regions, that can feed into the mix of policy making. It's been very noticeable, for example, that what's his name, Gates, the only US Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, the only one who's served both Democrat and Republican administrations, said that when he was asked at one time, what's the US biggest need in the defence area, and he said a stronger State Department. This was unusual coming from a Secretary of Defence, but there's been similar things said, I think, a lot of it. So, and I read a piece the other day that this is what the generals now are saying about President Trump, that they are lamenting the fact that they don't have a sort of strong State Department arm wherever they might be deployed to help them, because whatever you are doing, you want to have, as it were, a right hand and a left hand. You want to have hard power and soft power integrated to get a good result. I think that's one part of the problem.
There's a terrific line some Americans talk about, this disparity between resources to state and defence, and might I add also CIA, who operate quite independently. But the line goes that there are more marching bandsmen in the US Army than there are diplomats in the Department of State. I think we've probably got the balance wrong.
Peter, you mentioned the term whole of government, which kind of, by its very existence, implies that the different arms and departments and agencies of government need to do more to work together in a holistic sense. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. I'm just wondering at what point in time our government became so fragmented that it became dysfunctional, and whether or not it could ever come back together in a unified and nimble and well-informed and proactive sense.
Brendan will help me here, because Brendan was in finance for a long time and he saw some of this. I talk about whole of government because as we were doing these deployments, starting with Afghanistan, the Army was underdone. We weren't ready for Timor. We force structured for Iraq. There were three choices: main supply route, look after a prison, or babysit the Japanese. We finished up babysitting the Japanese in Al-Natana province because we couldn't take the ASLABs. We didn't have a proper tank. all our vehicles were made of tin and canvas, and we just couldn't expose ourselves. But people kept saying to me, "Oh, don't worry, it's a whole of government response." And I used to do what I call military tourism. I'd go to Iraq or Afghanistan twice a year, and I'd have a good look around. I never saw any whole of government. But the only indication was that there was some evidence of aid up in Baghdad. It wasn't down where we were. Occasionally going to Tarin Kop on a C-130, you'd see a couple of federal police. I think they were the same blokes going in every time. Having a look around and see where they'd come. Frankly, I don't think the federal police ever had any real intent of going forward. They hadn't force-structured for it. And so partly what I'm doing at the University of Canberra is to try and give effect to a whole of government. Where are you? I think you're right. It's not only that recent study. Leahy's done a couple of studies, disrepair and disarray of the Department of Foreign Affairs. So I thought, why I mentioned Kevin Rudd's national security statement, there was a hint it was going to happen.
What was the intention?
Duncan Lewis basically wrote that. It was delayed by about 6 months. Rick Smith wrote Annex A to it, and instead of having something like what I think we wanted, which was like the American national security system, Rick said, no, we don't need that. We'll do that by cooperation and collaboration. And in a government system where you have ministerial responsibilities, you're not going to get cooperation and collaboration. There was some feeble attempt to have a national security budget, in that would give some control over more money to DFAT or less money here and so on. Belinda Moss was it, I think. She had a go at that for about a year and a half. It fell over. And then the whole thing just started to fall away. Bureaucratic approach there. I don't think the bureaucrats in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet liked the thought that there would be someone giving advice directly to the Prime Minister. That was Duncan. They didn't like his having that access. I think we need to revisit it. And I'm hopeful that maybe if Jim Molan gets re-elected into the Senate, and I don't know about that, he, I know, is talking to Scott Morrison about having a national security strategy and hopefully a national security apparatus, because given the complexity of the environment we're in at the moment, we do have to prioritise, and we're just not doing it at the moment. Brendan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so
Sorry,
I think there's an even deeper problem. So when you work in Treasury, well, I'll give you an example. When I was in finance, someone found $100 million and said, we want to do something different on people smuggling, to stop it. And so I went out to all the departments and said, can you come back with interesting, different and innovative proposals? And we would go to government. And what I got back was, we will solve the problem if you give us more of what we're already doing. And every department said that. And the lesson in that, there were two. One is that the bureaucracy had not come to terms with the fact that the world does not organise its problems to fit our categories. So there was a real imperative to work across, and people don't like doing that. But the other thing is, you get intellectual domains like defence, non-defence security, economics, diplomacy, and they are large, what I call totalising domains. They have a worldview, and the real work has to be done to how do you bring them together, integrate them, or create something new. And so defence, for example, does not employ any economists. It's a big issue in shipbuilding that we don't really have an economic framework for it. Treasury, every time you have a defence discussion with Treasury, for them it's just another opportunity cost that should not be pursued. My staff in finance felt that any government expenditure by definition should be stopped. And the foreign affairs people, some of them are really good, but they tend to think about issues management. And so to me there's a real need to actually step back and say, well, we want to bring this together to think about how we want to exercise national power in the state system. So I agree with Peter. But one of the challenges is that our system of government is built on the principle of competitive advice resolved at the cabinet level. And I think there is a need for some integrating function to support that. Because, mainly because, I don't want to say the world was less complex in the past, it's not, but we've got to a situation where we're managing issues, we're not managing the whole system.
And before, I'll come to you in a moment, David, but for both gentlemen, are there any countries in the world that you think have cracked the code on how to manage the notion of national security?
In China.
Are there any liberal democracies that have cracked the code?
I think New Zealand does all right.
Okay.
If you have a look at some of their documents, particularly around the values and interests,
Okay.
I think they're doing all right. But then they really don't have the ability to execute it. Not that they need to, frankly. But as I look at some of these comparative studies around the world, some of the stuff coming out of New Zealand is really good.
The Nordics have actually, Norway, Finland.
Yep.
Now they have to deal with the Russians, so that concentrates their mind, but they've done a lot of work in this area, whole of government, whole of nation.
Can I just ask the two gentlemen from the inside about the elephant in the room, of course, is the political side. Take the case of defence. Just can't think offhand how many defence ministers we've had in the last sort of 20 years. Must be something like 10.
Yeah.
If you look back on all the big strategic decisions made over 100 years, it's the politicians who make these decisions, get them right or get them wrong, whatever it is, the politicians. How is, whatever structures you're talking about, what can be done to deal with the most important issue as the politicians?
My personal view is that we need to create a system that allows people like me, when I was in government, to talk to politicians as they're coming up in a safe place about issues without it becoming politicised. So, a friend of mine who was Secretary of Finance, the first time he met his minister was the day after the election. I often went to Senate estimates where my role was to reveal as little as possible. And I wanted to have a good discussion with the politicians because the issues are important. But, the way the system is constructed is that everything becomes politicised, so you're a weapon in their war against each other. And so to me, it means that they arrive into the decision making. Some of them are well equipped and have developed, but many haven't. And the debate is less mature than it could be. And so I think we need to build in those processes of getting to know people.
Just following up on that, do you think that having a parliamentary committee, or the parliamentary committees, subcommittees under the Foreign Affairs, Defence, etc. Committee, and also the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, are they pluses or minuses in what you're discussing?
They're pluses, because at least in some circumstances you can have a good discussion, and that a lot of that depends on the chair and the nature of the issue. But there are other times, like the time I sort of claimed public interest immunity on the submarine and shipbuilding issues. I wouldn't talk at all, it became very political, so it depends. But they are positive force rather than a negative force. But I think you need something where their earlier career, when they're just starting out, and where you can sort of have where you can have a discussion with both sides over time about the issues, about the long-term issues, the sort of stuff we've talked about today, the big debates, the debates over time, without anyone thinking that their career is at stake. And both sides of politics, rather than just... but at the moment it's a very fraught environment, and so it's very difficult to do that.
In my time as 8 years as either deputy or chief, I had 6 different ministers.
Shocking.
And I'm thinking of one who I met. I was up in 3rd Brigade in Townsville, and the land commander said, "The minister's coming to visit, would you brief him?" So we had him around to our house for dinner. My wife was in the room, and some of the COs were in the room, and we put up a slideshow. And I put up a picture of an armoured personnel carrier. He said, "What's that?" And my wife started laughing. She knew what it was. But the ministers would change, their staff would change, the assistant ministers would change. They'd take 3 to 6 months to get their charter letters out, so before that they'd just squabble over what they would do. Ministers were all different, which is good. We had one who was dyslexic, another one who wouldn't accept PowerPoint slides. Brendan Nelson had a bloody photographic memory and it drove us all nuts. Because he remembered absolutely everything, including Appendix 27 to Annex Z. And he remembered how many trucks were in it. So you've got to adjust for all of them. And that's reasonable because the variety is good and it's healthy for the political process, but I absolutely agree with Brendan. They need educating. Their staff need educating. And Anthony Albanese's staff, Mark Sawyer, has just started talking about this. He wants to start some sort of 101 for strategy for the staffers across the Labor Party. And I think we've got opportunities. Brendan runs a school. I've got a small institute, but you've got the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies. This is their job. The National Security College, this is their job. And I would say to any new politician coming into Canberra, Buster, come here, sit there for 2 weeks, and we'll fill your head full of just strategy 101.
Yeah. See, the other thing, my experience is they want to do a good job. They try to do a good job. So the question for us is how can we help them do the best job possible? And I think, we don't do that. We rely on luck and whatever they do for themselves. And so I would, just like to see more. The other thing I think is interesting about our current leadership is we have a generation of ministers who have not experienced an existential crisis. So right up until the 80s, you had politicians in Parliament who'd been to war or remembered the war. And we don't have that anymore. And so I think that, you get a sense that some issues which should have weight don't have weight, and other issues which shouldn't have weight have too much weight. So there's a question of proportion. But I think a bigger issue is that they lead very isolated lives and they're not, as connected as they could be through their careers.
I want to add 2 more points on this. I don't think bipartisanship, as it's defined in practice around defence, is a good thing. It's lazy strategy. They're just not prepared to talk about these things. And the other thing is, if you think the politicians are bad, sorry Brendan, have a think about the department. It's not particularly flash either. And if you look at the big strategic...
disaster after we left.
But if you have a look at the big decisions that have been made in the department, or by Australia, after my experiences around hunting and networking the army and trying to get a tank, I don't think the department is capable of making the big decisions. And if you look at the ASLAB, that was Kim Beazley on a shopping trip to the United States. The C-17s was Angus Houston had just become Chief of Defence Force, and we used to figure as chiefs that if the chief got on the Prime Minister's plane, he could normally get off with between 500 million and $1 billion. And we said to Angus, go get it. And he came off, big smile, said, he got $2.5 billion. that's where the C-17s come from. The process inside the department, the answer on a tank, we needed a tank, $520 million, and the answer, we pushed this through over 2 years, desirable, achievable, but not affordable, because the department was not able to reallocate funds, just like you're talking about the ministries. It couldn't make the decision between ships and tanks and planes. So somehow we've got to get these decision processes right.
And you appreciate that the combatant commanders in the US system, I think, are being given more sway in what capabilities they would like to see from each of the services, rather than letting the services actually decide what they...
It's happening a bit here. The Commander of Special Forces, he's got a fair bit of sway, and they've got pretty well got a budget, but they just tell fibs about what they want and go and get it anyhow.
That's right. Ladies and gents, I'm going to open that up to the floor now. So if there's some that would like to ask a question of the panel, Mike, you're next. Lady behind you first. Yep.
A rare female voice. May I ask any of the panel, are women, or do women find it difficult picking of continuity and change to get into strategic studies or defence research policy advisory, given our 5 panellists are men? Is this a difficult area for women to make progress in university?
Half my students are women, and some of my best students, and we're seeing more, and so we're seeing more women in the senior policy positions. The head of strategic policy and defence, Celia Perkins, she's a star, and then Rebecca Skinner, the associate secretary, succeeded me. At the school that I will head up from January, about 3/4 of the academic staff in security studies are women, and the issue for me is how to give them more profile in the policy environment. So it's increasing, and the person who is the National Security Coordinator in Prime Minister's Department, Carolyn Miller, she's in that role. And so it's increasing, but you know, it's still a field that tends to be dominated by men, but it's changing. And my view is we just have to keep pushing that. But what I see from my students is that there's some very talented people, and what I want them to do is to go into those careers and for our structures not to crush them, basically.
Is that because of tenure or?
No, it's a whole combination of things. I mean, when I was in the department and Dennis Richardson was the secretary, we did an analysis of the staffing composition for the public service components of the department, and we found that we were losing. Our entry-level recruitment was about 50-50, for male and female, in the sort of graduate areas, and but by the time they got into sort of 3 promotions, they were all leaving, and so there was something about the culture which was driving people out, and we spent a lot of time analysing that and working on it. What was a bit disheartening was that the people around the table said, well, we have a fantastic culture, and Dennis would say, well, the statistics are telling you something different, and so we did a lot of work, and but it takes time. It just takes time for people to rise through the system. So I'm optimistic about the future.
Mike.
Question initially for Brendan. Given the changing world and regional situation, and I think a perceived need to invest more in defence, what do you see are the lead times involved?
Look, I've spoken to the defence leadership at one of their work internal things. I said You know, I agree with Peter. Warning time's gone. You know, the issue is, do we have the capacity to manage crisis, which can happen very quickly. But what I said, my single biggest test for defence as an organisation, and this includes the ADF, is how fast can it change? What's its capacity to change its processes and systems and to grow and develop? And my view at the moment is that the world is changing faster outside than internally, and that's a problem. So I actually think that that we don't have as much time as we think, and any future crisis is going to test us not on day one, it's going to test us on day 10, and so to me that's where we need to think, and that's why I worry about I worry about recruitment, and both Navy, Air Force and Army are under strength and have been for a while. I worry about sustainability, but I also worry about things like blood supply, pharmaceuticals. Everyone talks about fuel, but these are just as important. So to me, it's not just a question of pouring in more resources, because having worked in the Department of Finance, there's plenty of money. There's a little room where they do print it. There's always money if you want it. There's always, it's always a question of priorities. But what I worry about is capacity and time scale. And the problem for defence is it takes about a decade to do something, serious. And it's got to be able to do it. In fact, my test is Singapore. Why does it take us 10 times longer to get something like, Super Hornets or whatever than it takes Singapore for comparable types of equipment? So that says something about our processes. So I haven't answered your question because I don't know the answer.
So I'll make the point that that was my comment about risk. The job for the Defence Force is to articulate the risk and give it to government, because they're the only ones who can solve it. And what I saw in risk in those early days, the Army, I joined the Army in 71, but the only thing we did during that period was get smaller. 34,000 as we came out of Vietnam, 24,000 when we went into Timor. We denuded whole ranges of capabilities, not only the manpower figures. It is a go-as-you-are war, and we're going to have to survive on that. And as I watch guys go into Afghanistan, we hadn't thought about that. Where's Afghanistan? What language do they speak? Oh, it's cold up there, is it? Oh, yeah. Well, we finished up in Paddy Pala buying bloody down jackets, because we had one platoon's worth of down jackets was the climbing troop over in the west. I don't think we've thought these sorts of things through, and the risk is there. And how that came home to me was in a number of Senate estimates, where the senators would, in mischievous ways, ask you, can the Army do more? And I would say, well, we've got something left in the cupboard. At the same time, we're scrambling back here, and you've got to be controlled in the Senate estimates. But the Army can do more because we had guys on 6, 7, 8 deployments. And the point I'd make privately to senators and others, if you've deployed the Army, you've got nothing left. The second Ringwood Boy Scouts aren't going to come and help you out. And armies don't stop. We'll fight to the last man, because you've got no alternative. And that's why we've got to be really good at articulating the risks back to government, because it's now their responsibility.
Here, then here, and then here.
Yes, we've been looking at a period of 120 odd years that Australia's been a nation, and all of that time I would have imagined that, I'm sure that most Australians would regard the core business of our defence and security forces as to keep the country safe from external aggression. Now we've seen for a lot of time that sometimes we've been better at it than others, but somehow or other we've got through. I want to know from the panel what they think now is our capacity, or the capacity of our defence and security forces to keep us safe from external aggression now and in the future, so that we can all go home and sleep safely in our bed.
Well, I think we've seen off the Musorians and the Cimmerians. We've seen off the Musorians and the Cimmerians.
Is it our core business? Is it your core business?
I'm not one who thinks that China is coming here in the next year or two. So I don't think we need to build up. We do need capabilities for the defence of Australia, but I don't think we need to build up because there's some massive Chinese invasion coming. I think that's just not on. I think we need to look carefully into these areas of cyber. Angus Campbell made a speech in May this year about issues of climate change. I am very much concerned that we are neglecting space and these non-traditional threats that are out there, transnational criminals, some of the problems around money and the movement of money and drugs. I think Scott Morrison in one of his early speeches about national security talked about domestic violence as a threat. I think that it's a threat, but I think it's going too far. I think we need to look at these other avenues and think, what do we do about that? Now, I don't think that you can say we're going to spend less on the Navy and the Air Force, because it's a whole risk equation, isn't it? Likelihood and consequence. It's not likely that China will attack, but the consequence would be catastrophic. So you've got to keep a balance in there. I think you can go home tonight. Maybe after a couple of glasses of red wine you'll sleep well, but I would be a little relaxed.
I'll do that at home, yeah. When we get home. Is that the panel's view? I mean, I'm not sure that was just the only view that you could have. Yeah.
Look, I don't go. I mean, I do worry, but I don't worry about the short term. I worry about the longer term. Mainly because in my career I've seen what I would regard as 3 strategic surprises. One was the shift post-Vietnam. The second one was Timor. The third one was 9/11. And they all shifted policy in quite substantial ways, and they were not expected. And so to me, the core issue is that we have a very capable defence force, so I'm not worried about our deterrent capabilities. I'm not worried about something happening that would really, challenge Australia's territorial integrity. But I am worried about the fact that the strategic order in the Asia-Pacific is changing, and as a country, our power relative to other countries is diminishing, which means that we can decide to be smaller, or we can change the way we do things and change the way we live in our region, which means we will need to think differently about how we do diplomacy and defence. And so the thing that worries me is that the internal debate among specialists like us and the external understanding in the community that there's a lag, and that if you do get a crisis, you don't have time to close that gap. I think the resource we have the least of now is time, and given the way the world works and so on. So I'm not worried in the short term, but I am quite anxious in the long term.
Thank you. And time is of the essence. The gap is quite a big one. The people of Australia are very concerned. China is arming at an intense rate, not seen since the rise of Germany in World War II. They're establishing bases all around our near north perimeter and getting themselves organised there. They're very strong to the South China Sea now. They're buying off our Pacific neighbours. They're building bases within our sector of the Antarctica. of Antarctica without any real notice or collaboration or discussion. Infiltrating our communities, institutions, attempting to white ant our local Chinese community and our political processes at all levels. Most of the community are in blissful ignorance. The Defence Force at the moment is about half the size it probably should be to be well prepared, to be considered well prepared. And now we're going with conventional submarines when there's a nuclear option that we should be getting into, in my view, for all 12 of them from the first submarine. It's immoral to send our troops in to do a job without giving them the best possible equipment. Therefore, the nuclear submarine is the best option. To keep the 6 conventional going as well and upgrade them, going to give us 18 submarines. A lot of extra cost in all of that. But there doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency from our political leaders. As you say, most of them are in blissful ignorance. They don't understand what's going on, don't understand their role in the whole process. We need to get a process of training them up and getting them fully briefed. We're only about one serious
cut to the
crisis
question, please?
or incident away from a major dilemma and big strategic dilemma. So how do we get some urgency out there in the community and get the politicians starting to think and discuss and debate this in our federal parliament? Thank you.
Well, Gary, I think that's your role, and the tenor of your statement there is clear.
Blood and treasure, and also buying off our Pacific neighbours, as you said, buying off everybody, enslaving them with debt. And some of these countries are run by despots, so the money doesn't go to the nations, it goes to educate the despots' children in Switzerland. Everybody else, generations later, are condemned to poverty. To speak strategically, I agree we need the submarines, although I'm not totally certain about that. Why we are asking our French suppliers to retro-design the nuclear submarines and fit them to burn coal and then make them in South Australia has always had me buggered. But indeed, to build them in South Australia, now that Christopher Pyne is no longer in politics, makes no sense at all. I guess,
Sarah get to the question.
Sarah Hanson-Young will not, to answer your question, will not allow us to have nuclear submarines, which serve us right if we couldn't get submariners to put in these generations old submarines, whereas American nuclear submarines or anybody else's nuclear submarines, you've got all the power, all the water,
Your
whatever
question,
you like.
your question, sir.
Only by the food you can carry on board. Now, to speak of then being cowed into submission, I was dismayed when I saw on television the Chinese display of military might 3 weeks ago on the 70th anniversary. What a fantastic display of military hardware and military forces drilled within an inch of their lives. Hugely impressive. But in the same vein as the submarines, one thing that dismayed me is on the back of trucks they had submarine drones. Well, if you don't have to sustain human life inside one of these tin cans, you can have something that fits on the back of a truck.
Is that the question?
No, part of the strategic issue, and Peter also made reference to cyber warfare. Does having all of this conventional hardware, no matter how sophisticated...
I can answer that bit of the question if you'd like me to, in terms of the cyber.
I'm almost there, Peter.
No, he wants to ask the question. The cyber, Australia has a capability for defence, and we have declared an attack capability from our cyber forces.
Good.
So that's the answer to your question.
Good on you. But
good question.
Does all this get knocked into a cocked hat when you've got pimply-faced 20-year-olds who can stop our water supply, our trains, our banking, and you did mention the cyber threat that we face. So it wouldn't matter, perhaps, in the future if we've got all the sophisticated hardware, another thing I worry about is the submarines in 30 years. In 30 years, will they be able to find the submarines under the sea and render them useless? Thank you, I'm
Thank
leaving.
you. We'll take that as a comment.
Good question.
Last question, and down back. Madam,
I have a question.
speak up if you could. Stand up and speak if you could.
It's a question that about a comment that was made a bit earlier about Australia not having the experience to exercise power. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were, whether there's a relationship of that to perceived leverage, and also what your thoughts are on how we can improve our exercise of power.
What was the question?
How we can improve our exercise of power.
Yeah, so look,
And whether there's a relationship to perceived leverages and
I think Australia has a lot of what I would describe as latent power. We have I think we have an economy about the same size as Russia's. It says something about Russia and where their priorities are. We have a sort of highly capable population in terms of education, technical capacity. We're a superpower in terms of resources, and we actually have an ADF that's the most capable that has been in my lifetime. But the question is, it goes back to this early discussion on national identity. Who do we want to be in the world? And what sort of country do we want to be? And if you're going to exercise leadership, which we do in some areas, but if you're going to exercise leadership in our region, then that means that you have to think about how you orchestrate power, how you integrate your instruments, and what you do in the world, and whether you go out and try and exercise agency and change the world, or whether you wait for things to happen. And Australia has always been active, but I think for a lot of our history, as we've talked about today, we've been active within coalitions led by other people, or within a strategic policy framework provided by the sort of governing power, the hegemon. And I think the future may be that we will have to do things by ourselves. And I think that will be a big challenge to our sense of who we are and our sense of our national identity. But when you look at what we have in terms of resources, capacity, people, in some ways we're a small country, but we're a country that can do a lot of things. And I think that one of the things that we will be discussing as a community over the next few years is how we want to be in the world, in a world that's not like the world that we've had in the past.
So it's like a natural progression or evolution then, because I agree, and I sometimes think maybe there's not enough thought laterally outside the box of how to do some of these things.
If you're a country that has spent its entire history as where your security order has been structured by a friendly power, the empire, or the US, the United States, and suddenly you're entering a world where that is not necessarily going to be the future, then that's a big moment. That's when, it's one of those big moments in a country, and I think we're going through that at the moment. I was really struck in the early presentation this morning where people identified, they said nation and empire are the same thing. I think that many people see the US alliance as sort of, we're an extension of, sort of the American system. But in the future, we may not be. And so we will have to be ourselves and to make decisions for ourselves, and that'll be a moment of growth and change, and it'll change Australia's strategic identity. And part of that will be the need to exercise power without the sanction or the support of others.
Can I just say that we did consider 100 years, 110 years of our history today, and in general terms, you might say that we've been sort of growing to maturity rather slowly. Britain for centuries has been willing to exercise power. We have not had any history of doing that. But there is a nice little beginning to all this, and that is the decisions made by the government in the period before the First World War. That is that we as Australia had to do something ourselves, and we decided to form the Royal Australian Navy. Doesn't sound too amazing now, but that was done against the advice of Britain, who said, you don't need a navy. We're looking after you.
And the Air Corps was the same.
And again with the Air Force. Yeah. So going back to the early time, we did make some important decisions for ourselves, and then we had a period of 80 or 90 years when that has not been the case. So it has been a period of growing to maturity, and it's a big step for a country to make from being a follower to exercising power in a positive way in your own right. And that's a step that Australia still is moving very hesitantly towards.
Thanks, David. I think on that sage note that we'll call it a day so you can get ahead of the Friday afternoon traffic. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your contribution and your time today. Thanks also to Greg as part of Navy Week for doing his introduction, and thank you for being such a well-behaved and generally compliant crowd. And I'm glad I didn't hear a phone in the last session, so that's terrific, and I wish you all safe travels on your way home this evening. Thank you.
In my opinion, and certainly you posed some interesting questions to us all, and that was supported by a first-class team who presented to us and facilitating this panel over the last 90 minutes or so. Even though you haven't done it before, I think you did a great job, and we all learned a lot. And I think you should be congratulated on what you've done today.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it
all together. Thanks very much.
Travel safe.